Hello and welcome to the channel. It is finally here, the first 3D tutorial in Construct 3 for this channel. I put out an introduction video a few days back to this series. If you haven't watched that yet, you might want to take a look at it. It explains how this whole series is going to work, and I will just briefly mention a couple of things about that. First is this is not going to be an actual game. It is going to be a bunch of different 3D type mechanics thrown into one project. This way, the series can be ongoing forever and ever. And in this particular video, it is going to be a long one, but it is going to cover all the basics to get us set up in 3D. After this video, we will just add to the project, but we'll use everything that we learn in this video for those other videos, because you don't want to have to set up a camera and a player character in every tutorial series, because it's going to take a while to get set up. And we'll get started with that first section now and get introduced to what 3D in Construct 3 is. On the start page of Construct 3, there is a search bar, and if we click in there and just type in 3D, it brings up all the sample projects that use the 3D feature in Construct 3. A lot of what we're going to do as far as the camera and the player movement mimics quite a bit from this first-person platformer project. And the second thing I want to mention right here at the start is that this project is probably not doable in the free version of Construct 3. The reason is layers. We will need multiple layers because in 3D, in Construct 3, it's all about what renders first and what renders last. And we use our layers to determine what objects get rendered on top of others. And the free version, I believe, limits you to 2 layers, and we'll be using more than that in this video. So for the free version, you probably won't get very far in 3D. All right, I am going to create a new project just like you would a 2D project, and I'm going to call mine 3D underscore tutorial. I'm actually going to choose SD landscape 16 by 9. That gives us a viewport of 854 by 480. We'll leave everything else as it is and create. Here is our playing field. We have this dotted line that is our viewport, and the rest of this is the layout size. We can make elements in 3D space anywhere outside of the layout or inside, and our camera is going to see it. So we're not going to worry about the layout size, but I am going to make sure we click on our layer 0 and then come over to the properties, and I'm going to tick transparent, because we do not need that. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is just click anywhere in this smaller square up here, and I'm going to insert a 3D shape. And I'll just click anywhere, just somewhere right in the middle of that. And this is our 3D shape. By default, a 3D shape is a cube, so it has 6 faces. And then if we exit out of that, we can see that our 3D cube is visible in the layout, and it previews it in what looks like 3D. If we push play, it does not look very 3D. That's because it's looking straight down and it does not have any Z depth that the camera is recognizing. And what I mean by Z depth or Z height or Z elevation is on the Z axis. So anytime I say Z, we're talking about the third dimension, because X is from left to right on your screen, Y is from top to bottom on your screen, and Z is up and down. So there's elevation. The bottom of this cube would be 0 elevation, and then the top of this cube would be, we have a height of 15. So if I click in this height area and I change that 15 to a 30, you can see that it stretches our cube out to twice the height. I'm going to go back down to 15. We'll talk about the Z height and Z elevation units later on. They do size differently than pixel values. Also on the cube, we have our faces. So you see the one that is facing straight up at us is the 6. Let's go into it again. You can see that the 6 is where it says front, and then left is 2, right is 5. So if I exit out, we see 6, which you would think 6 is on the top of the cube, but 6 is what is facing us in our 2D layout preview. So that is the front, and then 2, and then 5. So on the other side, we have a 4, And if we double click to go into it, we can see that the 4 is the bottom face and 3 is the top. So 4 for bottom, 3 for top. So if you just think of it as whatever is facing you in the 2D perspective, that is the front. And then you can adjust for everything else: left, right, top, bottom. Then the opposite of front would be back. But we can't see back because that back face is facing the ground. And by default, the visibility over here in the properties, back is turned off. That is because we don't want to render a side of a 3D shape that is not visible. So this 6 is our front face. If I untick front face, the front face is gone. Now we can see right through the cube. And then if I tick the back face to visible, now we can see the 1 way down there on the bottom, which is the back face. So you can use these to hide and make visible the different faces of the 3D shape. And most of the time we do this because faces that don't show during runtime do not need to be rendered, and that helps ease up the processing power of your machine that you're working on. We can also use images for faces. We will get into that a little bit later. While we're here getting familiar with 3D shapes, I do want to point out that if you have ever worked in any other kind of 3D program like Blender or Maya or even Unity, Unreal Engine, Godot, and so on, they have a 3D interface, which means you can control the preview monitor, how you see things in the layout, and you can move the camera around. Here, this is still 2D, and we can pan left and pan right, and it's just rendering the 3D shape so that we can preview what it looks like in 3D. The best we can do is zoom in and maybe get a closer look, but we can't move our preview camera in 3D space. This can be a little restricting at times, but after you deal with this for a while, you kind of get used to it. It might be a little awkward at first, but it does get easier to deal with. And that brings me to the last topic in this introduction section, and that is just my opinion on using Construct 3 for 3D game development. And it goes something like this. I do believe that there are elements to the 3D feature that will benefit 2D games. I think using a 3D object in your game could add to the atmosphere or the visual quality of your project. However, I think making a fully functional 3D first-person shooter game in Construct 3 is going to be a lot more work than if you used an actual 3D game engine. Because Construct 3, as it is right now and probably will be for a very long time from now, is still a 2D game engine. Even when you're using 3D shapes and 3D cameras, Construct 3 is still a 2D engine. It is just able to render from a different perspective. So my suggestion is to play around with this, get familiar with how 3D works in Construct 3, have fun with it, make some projects. But if you're setting out to make your passion project or your big game and you want to make a fully 3D first-person shooter or something along those lines, choose a 3D engine. And if you want to do any kind of 2D game, Construct 3 is far better than any game engine I have played around with, and I think I've probably played around with all of them. And when it comes to 3D game engines, Unity, Unreal, Godot, those are the 3 powerhouses in 3D game engine. I would say choose one of those because all 3 of them are free. And unless you make a hit game that is making millions, you can create, you can publish, you're not going to have to worry about paying for anything. So those are just my thoughts on using Construct 3 for 3D. I think it's going to be fun. I think using 3D elements in a 2D game is going to be a really big step for this engine. Let's move on to the next section. So in this section, we are going to create the 3D camera. And then we will give our player some controls and attach that camera to our player so that we see in 3D wherever our player character happens to be moving. So we're going to need to create some new objects for this section, and I'm going to start out by creating one here in our layout. I'm going to keep this 3D shape that we created earlier. I'm going to keep that there, and I'm going to double click in a blank area and grab another 3D shape, and we can insert that wherever. So our front is going to be facing up towards the camera. But when we put in a 3D camera object and start to view from its perspective, we're going to move it level with the floor so it's looking directly at the sides of these cubes. So we'll be able to stare straight at the 4 or the 2 or the 3 or 5. And the 6 will become the like the roof or the ceiling of this box. I wanted to say that because I want to change this dice pattern that we have in each of these spaces to a solid color. So I know that the front is going to be our floor. If we select the front frame here and press C on the keyboard, that will clear it. And then I will just pick a brownish color. So I'm going to go with something like that and get the fill tool and just fill that in. So if we exit out, we see that the top of our box, which is actually the front face, is now brown. Okay, I'm going to go back into it and I'm going to change the left, right, top, and bottom because those are in 3D space, those are going to be the sides. I'm going to change those to a darker brown. So if we click on each one of these and press C, we can clear these out. And then I'm just going to get a darker brown color and fill each one of them. Click on back, hit C to clear that. And I want to show you something here. When I clear the back and I exit out, over here in the Object Types folder, 3D Shape 2, which is, we haven't changed the name yet, the thumbnail preview has disappeared. This one still has the one side of the dice because that is showing the back frame. That's the first frame in this sequence here, so that's the one that it shows. It just so happens in this one, it's empty. So I came up with my own organizational process here. You don't have to do this. I'm going to slide this over to a full black, pick this back frame, fill it with black, and then I'm going to take my pencil tool with a size of 3 and a color of white, and I am just going to draw in the word floor. There you go. It's something other than nothing, and that's how I see it. So I'm going to click on that object, and I'm going to rename it. And here's another organizational tip. I like to start all my 3D shape names with 3D, and then I will put an underscore, and then just whatever it is. I'm going to call mine ground. This will be our ground object. I know I just named it floor in here, but that doesn't really matter. Okay, I want our ground to be level with our Z elevation of our layout. So essentially, I just want it to be at the 0 level. Right now, it has a Z elevation of 0, which is the bottom of the cube. And then if we scroll down, we see the Z height is 15. So I'm going to knock that down to 2. So now it's more of like a little platform, but it sticks up from the 0 level. So if I bring the Z elevation to -2, now the top of the cube, that will make it at the 0 height. We'll make more sense of this when we get into game. I'm just going to place this just randomly up here, zoom out a little, and I'm going to drag this corner out to cover a pretty large area. Okay, and if we play, the only thing that's changed is we gave it a brown background. I want to start making more layers when we put new objects in. So I'm going to come into the Layers panel and right-click and add a layer to the top. And I'm just going to call this one Player. And then I'll click on this layer 0 and I'll rename that to Ground Layer. So a good reason to have the ground layer on its own layer is if I want to box select, where you click and drag a box around to select items. If I'm in this area, I can't do that because it'll just grab onto the ground. If we have it on its own layer, we can just lock it, and now I can make that selection, except my cube is on the same layer. So I'm going to create a third layer, and I'm going to call this one Walls. And let's drag it down below the player. So we have ground, walls, and player. And then I will unlock the ground, select our 3D shape here, and move it to walls. And then I'll lock ground back. Okay, so now I can click on it and ground won't move. I can select our box and we're good to go. All right, let's make our player object now. I'm going to click on the player layer and double click, and let's scroll down to sprite. This is not a 3D shape. So insert a sprite and just anywhere. I'm going to change the size to 32 by 32. And again, this is just going to be a visual reference. We don't really need any image here, but I want to make something that's going to help us out when we are editing our game. So I'm going to zoom into this square here, and I picked me a nice bright green color and then the line tool, and I want the thickness to be 1. And I'm going to start in the corner and drag up to the middle of this side. And then I'll do the same thing here. And then take the fill tool and fill that in. And we just have us a nice green triangle. We can take the origin tool and press 5 on the numpad on the right side of your keyboard. And that will put it right in the middle. And then let's make sure that our collision polygon is covering the entire sprite. Looks good. Let's exit out of that and rename it to player. I'm going to move that in this smaller square here and play that, and you'll see we just have a sprite and a 3D cube that is looking straight on, so we can't really even see that it's 3D. This viewport smaller square here, we are no longer going to need it because now we're going to put a camera into the game, and this won't matter until we do some UI stuff. So I'm going to move our cube over to the middle of our brown ground area and get our player and put our player just somewhere kind of like that so that we're looking at the cube, but maybe kind of off to the side of it. And then just double click anywhere. The first thing in our plugins menu here is the 3D camera. Let's insert that, and that goes directly into our object types folder. It does not have any properties. It is just a plugin that we can reference in our code. Okay, and then one more object I want to create. I'll create this on the player layer and double click, and let's go grab another sprite. And we'll insert that, and I'm going to make this 32 by 32 as well. I'll zoom in, and I'm going to get a yellow color and the line tool and do what we did with the player. I'm going to make a triangle that is pointing to the right. I'll fill that in, and then I'll get the black and fill in the empty spaces. So this is some nice contrast. It'll stick out and we'll know what this sprite is. Make sure that our origin point is directly in the middle, and then let's exit out of that. And I am going to rename this cam_3D. So this object is going to essentially control our 3D camera plugin. And what we'll do is we'll give our 3D camera plugin some information, and then we'll attach it to this cam3D object, and then we'll attach the cam3D object to our player object. Okay, let's go make sense of all that. Let's hop over to the event sheet, and the first thing I'm going to do is add an event, go into system, and type in start of layout on start of layout. And I'm going to adjust some of this so that it is nice and big. If you hover your mouse over this center part of the event sheet and hold Control and scroll up, you can increase the font size or scroll down to decrease. I usually have mine pretty small when I'm working on my own, but for the purpose of trying to show people how to do this stuff in a video, I'm going to increase that font size pretty good to make sure that we can all see it. Okay, first thing we want to do, let's go add an action to this onStart of layout event, and let's make sure that our cam3D object is set to our player's position. So let's grab the cam3D object, double click on it, and then I'm going to type in set position. And for this one, we can actually just use position to another object and choose the player and an image point of 0. That'll put it right in the middle of the player. So when we start the game, no matter where this object is, it's going to snap right to our player. So I am going to just move it off to the side here because it does not need to be in our layout view here. The less clutter, the better. Okay, back on the event sheet. Once we set our camera object to our player, we can set our actual 3D camera plugin to look in the direction that will give us the 3-dimensional look. So let's add an action. Let's grab the 3D camera, and we want this one that says look parallel to layout. And we'll click next, And now it wants to know the coordinates of the camera's position. Where should it start? Where should it be? And we're going to give the camera X position to our cam3d object. So let's type that in, cam3d.x for the X value, and then cam3d.y for the Y value. And then the camera Z is how high off the ground is the camera. So right now it's 10 units off the ground. 10 units is still, it's kind of low to the ground, but it's not right on the ground. And we want our point of view to look like we are looking through our own eyes and not through our feet. So we're going to bump that up to 15. But we are going to be changing different heights later on, so we want to make sure that it is 15 units above where our camera 3D object is. So let's type in, I'm going to delete that. Let's type in cam3d.z elevation and then plus 15. And now it wants to know when the camera gets set parallel to the ground, where are we going to look? Well, we're going to look in the direction of our 3D camera object. So cam3d dot, and then it actually comes up as the first expression up here, and that's the one we want, is angle. So cam3d.angle, and then let's hit done. So now if we play this, you see we're not looking at the top of the cube because the top of the cube was the number 6. So now we're looking at that left side of that cube. And just take mental note of what this looks like, and I will show you if we move the cube back further and the player back further and then press play again, now he's way far away. So you get an idea of what we just did with the camera. We attached it to this object, and then we attached this object to our player, and then we set it to look in this direction. Let's head back over to the event sheet. So now we want to make sure that our camera is always following our player. Even though we don't have any controls for our player yet, let's go ahead and take care of our camera's position. So we want to update that every frame of the game. This code runs 60 times every second, so we want to update it every second. And we do that with an every tick event. So add an event, go into system and type in every tick. Then we can add an action, go get our 3D camera, and now we want set position. Hit next. So what this on-starter layout does is it sets everything up and puts everything in place. So before our player ever pushes a button or moves the mouse, this camera is going to be set in place. Now we want to update the camera every frame of the game to make sure that we are moving with the player. So let's set the camera's position to that camera object. So cam3d.x and cam3d.y, and then cam3d.z elevation plus, and that 15. So something I want to put into play here is to create our first variable, and this is a matter of convenience. You notice we had to put in 15 up here, and we also had to put 15 in down here. If we create a variable, we can only have to use that once. So let's right click in a blank space and go down to add global variable, and I'm going to call this one cam height. And for the value, I will just plug in 15. And then we can go into this action here and replace that 15 with cam height variable. And do the same thing with this one. Cam height, the variable. So now, if we play, we get the same results. Okay, just to show you what that cam height does. I move those closer. So you can see we are cut off from the bottom of the cube there. That's because our field of view is raised. So if I go into the event sheet and I change our cam height to 0, now the middle of our view is level with the ground. And if I do, let's say 5, now we are kind of hugging the ground, but we're not below the ground at all. So that's why I came up with 15, because that puts us high enough above the ground, and whenever we get the rest of the controls put in, it will look a lot better. Just a quick reminder, Make sure that you are saving your project. If it is the first time you're saving it, you'll have to give it a name for the file and make sure you're saving it in a location where you know where it is and can get to it. I'm going to go ahead and save mine and set that up. All right, once you have saved, let's go ahead and move on. So we have our 3D camera object following our Cam 3D object, our sprite that we made, every frame of the game. So whatever our Cam 3D object does, our 3D plugin object will do as well. But I want all of this to move along with our player because we're going to give our player the controls. So if our player moves, then I want our 3D camera to move. So we can achieve that by making sure that our Cam 3D object is attached to our 3D camera plugin. So let's add an action to the onStartOfLayout event, and let's go into our player object, and I'm going to type in the word child. And we have remove child and add child. I want to add a child, and we'll click to choose our Cam 3D object. And then I want the X, the Y, and the angle. And not the Z elevation. We just need X, Y, and its angle. So hit done. So when we run the game, it'll immediately set our camera up into position, and it will make the Cam 3D object a child of the player. So whatever the player does, the Cam 3D object will do also. And whatever the Cam 3D object is doing, our 3D camera plugin will follow suit. Now we're going to handle the mouse. So let's go over to our object types folder, right click and add a new object type. And we scroll down to input. Let's choose the mouse. And it puts it in our object types folder. Now we have a mouse object to reference. Let's go ahead and add a new event and go into our mouse. And down here in this lower section, we have one called on movement. And this is triggered anytime there is movement detected by the mouse. So let's choose that one. And we can add an action. And let's go get our 3D camera. When we move our mouse around on screen, we want our camera to move along with it. We are controlling the point of view of the camera. And we'll do that with the rotate camera action. So rotate camera. And for the rotate X, we are going to use the mouse objects. So mouse.movementX. Let's tab down. And for the Y, let's do the same thing. Mouse.movement. And this one will be movement Y. And then our minimum and maximum polar range is how high up we can look up and how low we can look down. Looking straight ahead is going to be 90 degrees. So from 90, when we look up, we're subtracting. So 90 is straightforward. We start looking up, 80, 70, 60, and so on. 0 would be looking straight up. I don't want to be able to look straight up, so I'm going to change that to 20 degrees. And then our maximum polar range down, if 90 is looking straight ahead, 180 would be looking straight down. I don't want to be able to look all the way down, so I'm going to come back to 130 on that. Okay, I'm going to play this, and you can see I am barely moving my mouse, but we are able to move the camera around. So we have some movement. That is way too sensitive, so I am going to click out of that. What we can do is divide this mouse movement by a number. And I'm going to divide it by 15. But instead of having to put divided by 15 twice, we can create a variable and we only have to do it once. That way, in the future, if we want to test with faster or slower mouse sensitivity, we can just change the variable number. So cancel out of that, and let's right click and add a variable. I'm going to call this mouse sensitivity. I'm going to use 15, hit OK, and then come back into this action and divide by mouse sensitivity for both of those. Okay. Now when we play, not near as bad, not near as sensitive. Now there is another issue. You see my mouse cursor on screen. If I rotate this way, once I go off screen, the screen stops moving, and I come back on, it moves again, I go off screen, and it stops moving. So there is a way to get infinite movement from our mouse. So let's Close that, and let's add another event and go into our mouse object, and let's go to on click. And we want the left mouse button clicked, hit done, and add an action. Go into the mouse object again. Let's get request pointer lock and hit next. So when we play, we can move until our cursor goes off screen, but if we click on the screen, now our cursor disappears and we have full range of motion of our mouse object. Okay. Not bad. Let's go back over to our layout now, and with our player character selected, over in the object properties, go to edit behaviors, add a new behavior, scroll down, and let's get 8 direction. And exit out of that. And I'm going to leave everything as it is. This is just going to show us how to move around. So in a top-down 2D game, you would use 8 direction to control your player. Works pretty well. But in a 3D game, our camera is changing angles, so we can use our arrow keys to move, and the movements are as if we were facing right in a 2D plane. So up is actually moving me left, right moves me up, down moves me to the right, and so on. And if I turn my mouse, then the arrow keys, if I'm looking to what would be the left from where we started, now the keys work correctly. We want the direction to move in according to what angle we are looking at. So I'm going to escape out of that, close it, and I'm going to come down here, go to edit behaviors, and let's just highlight that and delete it. We are going to make our own controls. So I am going to double click anywhere, scroll down to input, and let's get a keyboard and insert that. Now let's go over to the event sheet. So we're going to set up some controls. Our camera is done for the most part. We do have one more thing to add to it. We'll get to that in a minute, but we're going to start working on the player controls. So I'm going to start organizing a little bit. I'm going to right click in an empty space and add a group. And I'm going to call this one camera. And I am going to highlight all of these and move them into that group. And then I'll close that up so we can see what's going on here. I'm going to right click and add another group, and I'm going to call this one controls. Okay, let's add an event to our controls group and go get our keyboard. And I'm going to use the WASD keys to move around. So I'm going to use key is down, and I will select the W key, hit done, and then we can add an action, get our player, and then I'm going to type in move at angle. We want move at angle. Hit next. And the angle that we want to move at is whatever direction our 3D camera is facing. Let's type in the 3D camera plugin and then dot, and we want to get its X rotation. So camera X rotation. And then for the distance, I'm just going to put this at, let's just say 2 for a second. And then we can go check this out. And when I press W, I move forward. And when I turn around, I'm still pressing W. So you can see whichever direction I'm facing with the camera is where our player is moving. Okay? I am going to highlight this whole event here, Control C to copy, Control V to paste, and I'm going to go into the key and change the W to an S and hit done. Then we can go into this action. So if W is forward, then S would be backwards. So for our distance, all we would do is subtract it. So put a minus in front of that 2. And if we play that, we can go in and out, in and out. So if I want this to go faster, I would have to go in here and change this to a 4 and go in here and change this to a 4. And then now we go faster. Forward and backwards. Okay. So the issue is we're going to have 2 more buttons here that we can press, A and D, for left and right movement. And if I want to change the speed, I don't want to have to come in here and change the distance number 4 times every time. So if you haven't guessed already, we're going to make another variable. If we hover over one of these events and right click and go to add, we can add a local variable. So I'm going to call this one movement speed. And I'm going to enter a value of, let's say 400. And then I'm going to click and drag it till that line appears above the W so that it's at the very top. Now what the local variable did is it placed it inside our controls group, which means everything that's inside this group and below the indentation of this variable will be able to access the information in this variable, that movement speed of 400. Anything less indented further to the left is not going to be able to see this variable because our controls are going to be the only thing that needs to access this number. Okay, so now we can go in here and change our 4 to our movement speed variable. And then do the same thing here, but make sure that you still have that minus in front of movement speed. And then if we play and I just tap W, we went way far away. I'm just going to tap W again and it just sends us flying. So 400 is very fast, but I did that because I want to use delta time. So let's go in here. Let's just type in the letters DT and then asterisk for multiply. So we want movement speed times delta time. And then we'll come in here and we'll change this one to DT times negative movement speed. Okay, and if we play, now we move at a much more realistic speed. Okay, I am going to highlight this S is down event and Control C to copy, Control V to paste, and then I'll paste it one more time. So let's go into this one and double click and let's change this one to an A. And then we can go into this one and change that one to a D. So this is our left and right. So left, what we're going to do is come in here and we're going to change our angle. Since W was straight forward and S was straight back because we subtracted the movement speed, we can actually just change the angle by 90 degrees. So for A, we're turning left, and on a protractor, that would be subtracting the movement. So I'm going to subtract 90 degrees. And we actually don't want to subtract our movement speed. So delta time times movement speed and our X rotation minus 90. And then down here, let's go ahead and get rid of that minus sign there. And here we will add 90 degrees because we're going to move to the right. So now if we play, we have full range of motion. We can control our player and our camera, and the only thing we can't do is jump yet, which we will cover in a future section. So for now, we have a working 3D environment. If we look down, we can't look straight down because we set our minimum and maximum polar range to not be able to look down. So I'm going to go change that real quick. In our camera group, our on movement event here, and I'm going to change our polar range to 180, our max polar range. That'll allow us to look straight down. So you see our camera object there. Now our camera object is going to face whatever direction our player object is facing. So if I exit out of this and I go to our Cam 3D object, and we're probably gonna have to access it through our layout, go down to the bottom of its properties and click initially visible or untick it. And if we play, now we see through to our green player object. But you notice I'm moving my camera, but it's always pointing the same direction. We want to make sure that it is facing the same direction our camera is looking. Let's go back over to our event sheet, and in the camera group, let's go to the every tick event and add an action and grab our player, and every tick I want to set the angle. I want to update the angle to a new angle, and that's going to be the angle of our 3D camera plugin. So let's type in 3D camera and then dot, and the angle we want is that camera's rotation. So camera X rotation. So now when we play and I look straight down, if I move the camera, it's always pointing the same direction I'm moving the camera. Always looking straight forward. Okay. I just want to make sure that we got that in. I almost forgot about it. Okay, just a couple more things and we're going to be done with the controls section here. Let's go into our layout, and in this 3D shape object that we have, I'm going to give it a behavior. Add behaviors, add a new behavior. Let's give it the solid behavior. And now we don't react to it because we don't have any code in our player object. Normally, in a 2D game, we would give our player the platform behavior or the 8-direction behavior, and it would react to solids. Even though this is a solid, we don't have any code that tells us to react to it. So we need something that tells us to react to that. And we'll do that by adding a custom behavior. So let's click on our player object, and then over in the properties, let's scroll down, go to edit behaviors, add a new behavior, and scroll down until you see this little wrench icon that says custom. Let's add that. And I'm just going to change this to 0 just so that it doesn't have any value, and we will give it our own value. Okay, so let's go over into the event sheet. And while W is down, let's go ahead and add an action to that. Go into our player, scroll down to the custom actions. We're going to push out solid. And if we double click on that, it'll add it, and it gives us some choices. Which direction do we want to push out? Do we want to push out the opposite angle, up, down, left, right, or nearest? And we're going to go with nearest. This is going to make it to where not only do we hit and collide with solids now, but if we are facing a wall, either head on or just at an angle, we won't get stuck because it will detect that we are in contact with a solid, so we should stop moving, but it's going to push us out at the nearest angle. So I'll show you what we mean. Let's hit done, and I'm actually going to, while that's highlighted, Control-C to copy, and then just highlight this, Control-V to paste, and then same thing here, Control-V, and then here, Control-V. And just for looks, I'm going to drag those to the bottom of each event. Okay, let's play. And now I run into it. But whenever I run into it, if I keep pressing W, it moves me to the side. And the more angle that I turn my camera, the further away it pushes me from that side. So that helps us not get stuck, while also giving us the chance to get blocked by a solid. Okay, so I'm going to close that up, and you don't have to do this part, but I'm going to add a debug control because this is just bugging me whenever, if we play here and I click in it and it locks our pointer. To close out of the tab, we hit escape and we drag our cursor up here, and the screen moves with it, and it just kind of distracts me sometimes. So I created a debug control for this. So I'm going to add an event, go to keyboard, and on key pressed, I'm going to choose the 0 key on my numpad and hit done. And I want this to close out the screen when we run the game. So to do that, we're going to need to get access to the browser that it plays in. So on Object Types folder, if we right click, add a new object type, scroll down towards the bottom. It's actually at the very bottom under web, we have browser. Let's insert that. And then we can go to action, and there it is. Let's go into that. And then scroll down to the bottom, and we want close. I'm going to move this to the very top. And if we play now, I click into it, I have control, I move around. So instead of having to go up there and click that X, I can just hit 0 and it closes it out for me. So just a matter of convenience. You can do that if you want. It is absolutely not necessary. And now that we have everything in groups, I'm going to organize one step further and start creating subfolders in our object types folder. So let's right click and choose add subfolder. I'm going to call this one input. And I'm going to right click on it and add another one. I'm going to call this 3D OBJ. That's for our 3D objects. And then I will right click again, add another subfolder. I use this one, I always call it meta, just for metadata. And it's just the behind the scenes things that don't really have another category. So I'm going to start putting these in their folders. So 3D ground will go in our 3D objects. And our 3D camera will go in our input. Browser will go in our input. Mouse and keyboard will both go in our input. And I can close that one up. My 3D shape can go in our 3D objects. And then Cam 3D will go in meta. And it looks like I need one more. And I will right click on object types folder, add subfolder, and I'll just call this one objects. And I'll put the player in objects. So now we are nice and organized. Okay, go ahead and save. Save as often as you can think about it. And we will move on to the next section. So in this section, I am going to cover 3D shapes and textures. This way, we'll be able to block out levels and change up the monotonous view of solid colors and the fact that we don't have a depth of field really with our 3D camera. And we can add fog. I won't do that in this video, but there are examples out there where you can add fog, and that helps add a little depth. So we need to dress up the level, and we can do that by adding objects in our level, 3D shapes, and putting textures to them, and we can decorate our walls and the boundaries and the floor. So I'm going to cover a little bit about that in this section. And I'm going to use this 3D shape we have that we've been referencing so far. We're going to rename this to our walls. So with it selected, let's go up here, and this is going to be a 3D object. So 3D underscore and wall. Now I want to change the image of this. I don't want 3D cube dice all in my level because that would look ridiculous. So what that's selected in the properties, we can scroll down here, and I mentioned before how we can untick some of these so that not all of them are showing. We also have the option to add an image, and I've been calling these textures, and this is what I'm referring to. So our front face object, we could just click on this white square and it shows us what images we have available. These are the two sprites that we've created so far, and we could select one of those and hit OK. And now our top face is a triangle with transparent sides on it. Doesn't look very good. So to get rid of it, we could just click on that same box again. And then over here it says clear selection. Click on clear selection. And then you have to make sure that you hit OK after you clear the selection. And once you do, it takes it out of there and it replaces it with whatever the default is. And the default is whatever is in this frame. So I'm going to exit out of that. I want to bring in some textures that I have set up. So I have put a link in the description to my itch page. And this is where I'm going to house all of the assets for any projects that I do on this channel in the future. So if you have your own textures, fine. If you don't really care about textures and you want to go with solid colors, also fine. The textures do help with the visual aspect of the project. Go ahead and go to that link and download them and put them in a folder somewhere on your device where you can get to them. I have mine pulled up in a window off to the side on my second monitor over here. So I'll be importing them that way. And over in our layers panel, I'm going to right click and add a layer to the bottom. And I'm going to call this one textures. And textures is going to house only textures, and they're not going to do anything. They're just going to sit there. And the reason is because for a texture to show up on a 3D shape, it has to be in the same layout that the shape is in. With our textures layer selected, let's double click off to the side here. And I'm going to go down, and you can use these images or textures in three ways. You can use a sprite and just use an image. Another one is 9-patch. I don't think I've really gone into 9-patch on this channel. I've used it in my own projects a few times. There are instances where this can come in very handy. We are going to use tiled background. This is the third and probably the most efficient way to put images on your 3D shapes that I have found anyways. So let's go ahead and insert one. And I'm going to click off to the side here. And I am going to go to that folder of all the images that I have for download on my itch page. And I'm going to bring in each one of them one by one. So the first one, I'm just going to grab one. I'm going to go with Rock Dark, and I'm going to place it, and it places it, and it also crops it down to size. So we don't have to do anything to it. I'm going to exit out of that, rename this, TEX underscore rock dark. Okay, and then I will double click and go down and get me another tiled background, insert it over here. And I'm going to grab rock blue this time, and I will exit out of that and rename it TEX underscore rock blue. And I'm going to do this same thing for everything else in this folder. We can double click, go get a tiled background, insert it, and then drag in our next image. And then we exit out of it and rename it, and then repeat the process until you have all of them in. Okay, so as a tiled background, the good thing about these is that it stays one shape or one size, and if we drag it out, it just tiles it. It makes tiles out of that one image. It does not stretch or squash the image. I am going to take this 3D object and I'm going to place it over here in the corner, and I'm going to size it to a wall. And let's go with, actually, let's change the height of 10. So if we zoom in, now we have just kind of a more of a wall size and a nice even number of 10. So I'm going to place it right there, and then I'm going to stretch it out like that. And then if we go into this, it's not very tall, and that's at a height of 15. So I'm going to just double that, and you see it update in the layout there. And I think that's better. That's good for now. Let's just go ahead and make that an even 40, and we'll just call that good. In 3D shapes, you'll notice that this blue line, this outline here, is outlining the shape in its 2D form. So if I don't have this selected and I'm looking for it, I can click up here all day long. Construct 3 is not going to recognize it because the object is actually down here at the base of the object. And you can see it's just that rectangle, that outline of the actual shape itself. Okay, I'm going to use, I think, this texture rock dark texture. So what we can do is make sure that we have our wall selected, and I'm going to scroll down, and we know that the top is the front. We've established that before. So if we're looking straight at it, the top is the front, this side would be the top, and then this side would be the bottom. So I know that I want to put the texture on the bottom face. So over here where it says bottom face, down at the bottom, I'm going to click that box, and now we have all of our textures that we imported. And I said I want this dark one. I'm going to click that, hit OK, and it updates immediately. Now we have a rock wall. And I don't know about you, but I think it looks a lot better. And it has the solid, so we can run along against it, and it keeps us inside the level. Prevents us from going further. Okay? So in this situation, we don't need this back side, which is actually the top part of the object. So I can go over here to top face and untick it, and that way the game engine's not rendering one of the faces that we never see. And then if we double click to go into it, I'm actually just going to clear all these out. So click on one, press C to clear, C to clear, C to clear, and do that for all of them. And then I'm going to get a really dark brown color, something like that. And I'm just going to fill in all of these. I am going to what we were talking about earlier, how we wrote in the name. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to just to stay organized. So if I open up this object, I know it's on the back frame or the back face. I'm going to get a white color and the pencil tool with the size of 3, and I'm going to draw out the word wall. Let's zoom into this wall, and this is kind of what I was talking about in the first section where our perspective in the layout is limited. We can just kind of zoom in like this. One thing I want to show you is Z tiling factor. The default is 8, but if I change this to say 16, you see the image updated right away, and now it's squashed. It's stretched out side to side, or it looks kind of like it's being squashed down. And if I changed it to, let's say 32, it's even more. So you see what the Z tiling can do. It helps adjust the image to the size of the shape that you're using, depending on what you're looking for. In general, this default of 8 is going to work, especially with these smaller projects. All right, now that we have us a wall, I am going to highlight this wall, Control, click, and drag out a copy. And I'm going to drag it all the way to the other side. And we can do one of two things here. We could rotate this 180 degrees, and the same bottom face of the 3D shape would be facing inwards. Or we could keep them all facing the same direction and just change their size and what faces are visible. So we untick the top face. We can actually tick that to make it visible, and then untick the bottom face. And then we would need to come down here and get our top face and make sure that it has that rock texture. And now it does, but we don't need this back side, so let's go into our bottom face and clear selection, hit OK. So now, even though we can't see that it was even there in the first place because we had faces unticked, but if we ticked it, it's that solid default brown color. But I'm going to untick it so it doesn't render, and if we play, we have two walls. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for the sides. With that selected, Control click, drag out a copy. So here, I'm going to scroll up in the properties to the size. I'm going to change the width to 10, and then change the height to, I don't know, we'll start with 500, and then I'll just move it into place. Something like that. And then we can stretch it out on both sides. And now we know that if this is the top, then this would be left and this side would be right. So I'm going to go down here, and I am going to untick the right face because we don't need that side. And on the left face, I'm going to put in that rock texture. And then on the top face, I am going to clear that selection. And then, of course, we can take that one, Control click, drag another copy over to this side, and just reverse our process. Instead of the left face showing, I want the right face to show. That rock texture, we can delete the left face, clear that selection, and then make sure that our right face is showing, and then we don't need the left face. So we should have 4 walls. And we have us a little room. All right, we will start filling this room up with other things. And just to kind of show you what we can do, I have some other objects over here, or I mean some other textures rather. We have a wood crate, which will make a nice little boxy wood crate. And we have some other floor patterns here that you can use. We might use a couple more in this video. And then we have one that I call beam. And I'll show you why. What I'm going to do is copy a wall. So I'm going to click and drag, Control click and drag out a copy. And I'm going to move this in and just make it a little more like a column or a beam. Then we can come over here and make this exact. I'll just say, let's say 40 by 40. Well, actually, our textures, I believe, are 32 by 32. Yes, 32 by 32. So let's make this wall also 32 by 32. Change width and height to 32 by 32. Okay. And now, over in the properties with it selected, I'm going to show all the faces for now, except for the back face, because the back face is the bottom, and we're not going to see the bottom of it. And I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to clear this and place it up against the wall somewhere. Something like that. This is not very exact. I just want to show an example. So if this is the top, then we know this is the bottom, and then we have the right and the left. So I want left, right, and bottom. We can turn off front if we want. We don't need it. I want left, right, and bottom. So we also don't need top because we don't need that to render either. So down here, I said left, right, and bottom. So left, I'm going to pick that beam. And then right, I'll also pick the beam. And then bottom, I will also pick the beam. Now you can see what we have here. And you can adjust this to make more beams or just one single beam. Let's go over to the texture. Yeah, so the texture is 2 beams. So 32 by 32 will give you 2 beams. So we could go and change its size to 16 by 16, and we have one single beam. And then what you can do is just control click, drag out a copy, and then just place a few of these around. Now, whenever you come back over on this wall over here, you can either rotate it, or I'm going to move that into place, or you can just get rid of that left side. So untick left, and then we need the top now, and then make sure that top has that texture. And now, when we play, we have something that's kind of breaking up the scenery and helps with that lack of camera depth. So the more we start putting into the scene, the more actual 3D environment it'll start to look like. Because right now, just looking at this can kind of mess with your eyes. So we have the option to set dress, which just means adding objects and images and textures and whatnot. I'm going to exit out of that. And I am going to, first off, I'm going to move my player back a little. I'm going to unlock our ground so I can select the ground. And then I'm going to go down here, and we just need that front face really. So I'm going to get rid of the rest of these and come down here to front face, and I'm going to give that this gray rock texture. And then I'll lock it again so we don't mess with it, and I'll play. So now we kind of have almost like a dungeon cave-like room, but it has texture to it and makes it a little more pleasing to look at than a solid color. Make sure you're saving. One last thing I want to do in this section is set up something that we're going to need in the next section. Let's unlock the ground and click on the ground, and I'm going to drag it about just a little less than halfway. And then I'm going to control click and drag out a copy to this side so that we leave us a little gap in the middle. And we might need to adjust that layer, and that's fine. Okay, another thing I'm going to do is control click and drag out another copy, and I'm just going to resize this down, and I am going to go in here, and I'm going to make the width 10, and then our height can be, let's say 300. Give us some room to work with here. And I'm going to move this over here close to our other ground object, and I'm going to scroll down on the properties, and I'm going to set that Z height to 1. And then I'm going to turn on the left and right face, and then I'll turn on the top and bottom face. So the back face is going to be the only one that doesn't show. That's the bottom of the 3D shape. And you can kind of see the sides of it here are now showing. I'm going to click on that again, and I'm going to scroll down, and I am going to give our left face, let's go with the blue. And then I will give the right blue, the top, the blue, and the bottom blue. So it should have that texture on all 4 sides, and it does. Now I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to just kind of use my arrow keys and move it into place here. Our ground texture, its elevation is at -2, but its height is at 2, so the top of the 3D object is actually at a height of 0. So this one, I'm going to change the Z elevation of it to 0, so it's actually higher than our ground. So if we play, you can see it pops up. Okay, now I am going to control click and drag out a copy. And I'm going to zoom in, and I want this to be flush with that, right up next to it. I need to move it up too because I want it to be even. This one is still the same height as the first one, so I want to change its elevation to 1. So it's 1 unit higher. And I'll play, and what we're looking at is the beginning of some stairs. Okay? So I'm going to do this next one a little bit more efficient way. This is something that Construct 3 Engine has available to us. If we select the object, Control-C to copy, and then Control-V to paste. And when we paste with Control-V, it gives us this little plus sign. And wherever we click, it will place it right there. For instance, it places the copy right there. I'm going to Control-Z to undo that, and then I'm going to Control-V to paste again. And this time, I'm going to hold the Shift key and then click. And what it did is it placed it exactly in the same spot of where it was copied from. So we put these at a width of 10. So I could push the arrow key over 10 times, or I could hold down Shift and press the arrow key right, and it moves it over 10 pixels. So now I know that it is in the exact same spot, just 10 pixels over. And then I can go over into the properties and change the Z elevation to go up 1 more, which would make it 2. And then I can, with that selected, Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, hold Shift, click, hold Shift again, right arrow, change the Z elevation to 3. So now we have a bit of a staircase going on. Now, it doesn't do anything because we don't have gravity set up, we don't have anything set up. And this is a 3D object, but it does not have any properties like solid or anything like that. So it's just visual at the moment, but I want to add a few more stairs so that we can really test this out. So I'm going to repeat the process with that selected. Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, hold Shift, click, hold Shift again, press right over, and change the Z elevation to 4. Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, Shift click, Shift right, and change the Z to 1 more. And what does that give us? 6 of them. I'm going to do a couple more. So repeat the process again. Control-C, Control-V, Shift click, Shift right, change our Z elevation, and 1 more time. All right, that should give us a pretty good distance to go up in stairs. Okay, next I'm going to take this top one and I'm going to stretch it out a little. And we'll say we'll even this off at 100. And that actually resized it from the middle, so I'll need to adjust that. Make sure that's the last step. I'm going to take this ground piece, and since this one is at an elevation of 7 and a height of 1, I need to account for a total of 8. So if this is at -2 with a Z height of 2, I'm going to put this at 6, and that should be even with this object, this last step. And that should do it. So the problem here is that the texture doesn't match up. I'm going to change the texture of one of these grounds. So I'm going to click on this one up here and scroll down, and where we have our rock gray, I'm going to change that to, let's do this hex brown. And there we go. We have some stairs, we go up, and then we have a new floor. So we will use this later in the game. In fact, I'm going to give this texture on the sides. I want that left face to show. And actually, let's make the height 8. So there's 8, and I can drop this elevation back down to 0. And now it is still flush with that top step. And we now have a wall underneath. And I will take that left wall and we can just put this dark texture back in there. Okay, so something like that. This will give us something to work with. And by us sitting here creating this gave us a little more practice on how to deal with 3D shapes and images and textures with the 3D shapes. I'm going to exit out of that, and I'm going to do one last thing. I'm going to come over here to our object types folder, right click, and add a subfolder. I'll call this one textures. And I'm going to move all of these textures into that folder, close them up, and now we are all organized. Let's go ahead and save again, and that will take us to the next section. So in this section, we are going to set up the gravity for our player. That's not all we're going to do, but building around the idea of having gravity for our player is what gives us the effect of being able to run and jump and climb stairs and hop up onto higher platforms. And when we get to the event sheet and we start plugging all this code in, I'm going to have to create most of the code first before we can ever test it. And the reason is because the code won't do anything. It won't affect anything. We'll have nothing to see if we try to test it before the code is finished. But I'll walk us through it as we create the code, and then at the end we can test it and then come back and look at the code and see why we did things the way we did. So to get started, we're going to be on our layout, and we need to give our 3D ground the solid behavior. Our ground needs to be solid to give our player something to interact with in Z space. So we'll be able to jump up, and then it needs something to land on and keep us from falling through the world. We can go over to our 3D objects and select the ground. That will bring up the object type properties. Let's go to behaviors, add a new behavior, and choose solid. And if we go ahead and play this, now we are actually on a solid object. And if I move up here and try to interact with the stairs, nothing's happening, even though we are still on solid objects. Now watch what happens when I go to this empty space. Did you see how it kind of snapped me out here into the black empty space? Not only that, but now we can't get back on the ground. That's because we're being blocked by a solid object. But the reason we were able to move around on the ground is because of what we set up in the controls. We added the custom behavior and added the push out of solid with the nearest area. So what's happening is every time we push the W key or the A key or any key to move, that action, that custom behavior, is pushing us out to the nearest area. And that's why when we got so close to the edge, it snapped us out because it was pushing us away from the solid. And then we were just in an empty space and we couldn't get past the solids because, again, this behavior is pushing us away from solids. So we are on a solid. Now, once we start putting in some of the code, we're going to take care of this by enabling and disabling the solid object every frame. And that will allow us to move freely until other conditions are met. So now that we have a solid behavior on our ground, let's go over to the event sheet and get started on some code. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is right click in an empty area, and I'm going to add a group, and I'm going to call this Z elevation. And then I'm going to right click on this group, go to add subgroup. And I'm going to call this first one jump. And then I will right click on Z elevation group again, add another subgroup, and I'll call this one collision with ground. And then I'll do it one more time. And this one I will call elevated platforms. Now this does not mean elevators. This just means platforms that are higher up from our lowest part of the ground. So these are a little out of order for me. I'm going to move jump to the top and move collision with ground above that so that they are in this order. And I'm going to leave jump open, And then we're going to be creating quite a few variables for this section. So the first is a variable that checks what our player's Z position is. So if we right click on the Z elevation group, go to add, and down here we have add global variable. And I'm going to call this capital Z and then axis. And I'm going to leave the value at 0 and then make sure that static is checked. If it's not checked, we do need static checked. So hit OK. That did not do what I wanted it to do. Wherever yours ends up, let's drag it underneath the Z elevation group, but make sure that it's not indented any more than the subgroups. This becomes a local variable now, and it is accessible only inside this Z elevation group. Okay, let's add another variable. And if we come down here to this little empty space and right click, there we have add local variable. And I'm going to call this one gravity. And for the initial value, let's go with 3. And again, I did that incorrectly, so we can just click and drag that up there. Now let's go into the jump subgroup here and add an event to jump and go into system, and let's get an every tick event. So in our every tick event, let's add an action. Let's go to our system, and I'm going to type in subtract from, and we want our Z-axis variable, and the amount that we are going to subtract from that Z-axis variable is our gravity variable, and multiply that times delta time, and that is it. So every frame of the game, we're going to be subtracting 3 times delta time from this 0 number. It is subtracting our Z position in 3D space and throwing us down towards the ground. So let's add another action to this every tick event. Add action, go into our objects folder, and let's get our player. And I'm going to type in set Z elevation. And every frame of the game, we are going to set our player's Z elevation to its own Z elevation at that time, and then we're going to add the value of our Z axis variable. So we can just type in self, and there's our player, dot Z elevation, and then plus, and then our Z axis variable. So this will continuously set our player's Z elevation in 3D space to whatever this equates to. Okay, now I'm going to go up here. If we right click on one of these local variables, we have add another variable. So that's how I'm going to do it this time. And I'm going to call this variable on ground and change the type to a Boolean and hit OK. This is going to do exactly what it says. It's going to tell us whether or not we're on the ground or not. And I'm going to drag that down. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Right click, add another variable, and I'm going to call this one jump strength. And that's going to be a number. And I'm going to set it to, I'm going to go a jump strength of 1. Okay, back down here in our jump subgroup, let's add a new event to jump. And let's go into our input, get our keyboard, and on key pressed, and I'm going to choose the space bar. And this is going to be how we jump in game. So with this whole event selected, press B on the keyboard to give us a blank sub-event. And then I'm going to double click to go into it, go into system. I'm going to type in Boolean and is Boolean set. And on ground is our only Boolean, so that's the one we want. And then we'll add an action to that and go into system, and I'm going to type in set value. And we want the Z-axis variable, and the value is going to be jump strength. So when we tap the space bar, as long as we know we are on the ground, then we're going to change the value of our Z-axis, and our player's elevation is going to get set to that value, and then gravity is going to kick in and lower that value every frame of the game until we're back on the ground. So that is essentially how jump is going to work. So I'm going to close this up now, give us some more room, and I'm going to open up our collision with ground. And while we're thinking about it, let's go ahead and make sure that we hit the save button. So let's add an event to our collision with ground subgroup and go into our system. the first thing we're going to check for is that z-axis variable. So I'm going to type in compare, and I want compare variable, and I'm going to compare the z-axis, and I want to know if it is less than 0. Hit done, and then let's double click on this same event, and let's go get our player object in our objects folder, get the player, and I want to know if we are overlapping the ground object. So I'm going to type in overlapping. I want is overlapping another object, and we can click to choose that object, and that is going to be our 3D ground object. And we have a couple more things that we want to check in this same event. So let's double click again to add another check, and let's go into our 3D objects folder and get our 3D ground object. And I'm going to type in Z elevation, and I want to compare Z elevation. And I want to know if it is greater than or equal to our player dot Z elevation minus the ground's Z height. And since we're already in the ground object, we can just use the self again. And there's self dot Z height. So we're going to take the elevation of our player and subtract the ground's height value. And then we're going to see if the ground's Z elevation is greater or equal to that value. And then we're going to use this same thing and check another value. So let's double click on the event, go into 3D objects, get our ground object. I'm going to type in Z elevation, and we're going to compare Z elevation. We want to know this time if it's less than or equal to, and we're going to do the same thing, player dot Z elevation minus self dot Z height plus 5. So let's hit done, and I'm going to move that over just a little bit. So this is our first event here in our collision checks. So when all of these 4 conditions are met, then we can set up what happens in our actions. And we're going to need another variable. We're going to need to know what our Z position was the previous frame. So I'm going to come up here and right click on one of these variables and add another local variable. And I'm going to call this one player Z check. And we're going to leave that at 0, and we can hit OK. And then let's go ahead and start adding our actions. So add an action. Let's go to system, and I want to set the value of our z-axis variable to 0. So this is just going to reset the value of this so that we can change it when we jump or fall from higher ground. And then let's add another action, go back into system, and I want to set the value again, but this time we're going to set the value of our player Z check to our player's actual Z elevation. So type in player dot Z elevation, and we are good to go. And let's add one more action, and this time we'll go into our objects folder and get our player. And I'm going to type in Z elevation. Let's get set Z elevation. We're going to snap the player's Z elevation, which will be our player's feet basically, to the top of the 3D ground object. So to get that, we'll type in the 3D ground object. So 3D underscore ground dot Z elevation. And the Z elevation is going to be where the bottom of that ground object is, however high in Z space it is. And then we'll just add its height to get the top of the object. So plus 3D ground dot Z height. Okay, so we have a lot going on here. We're checking for all of these to be true at once. And once they are, we're resetting some things so other things can happen. And then we make sure we know where our player was in Z elevation, and then snap our player into the correct Z position. Okay, I'm going to highlight this whole block of code. Press B on the keyboard. That gives us a blank sub-event. And if all this happens, all this is true, and then all this occurs, then we know that our player is standing on the ground. So let's set that on-ground variable to true. So we don't need to check for anything here. We've done all our checks and set everything in motion. We're just going to make sure this all takes place, and then we'll add an action to our sub-event. Go into system. I'm going to type in Boolean and set Boolean on ground to true. So I'm going to highlight this whole block of code again and press B once again. And that gives us another sub-event that is indented the same amount as our other sub-event. So we want to make sure that it is not indented as a sub-event of this event. This is just another sub-event of this main event here. So let's go into our new sub-event and add an event to that. So double click on it. And let's go into the system. And I'm going to type in Boolean again. Is Boolean set? And we want to know if on ground is on ground true. I'm going to double click on the event again and go into system. And I'm going to type in variable. I want compare variable. And I'm going to get our player Z check. And I want to know if it is less than or equal to. And the value is going to be our player dot Z elevation minus 0.5. And this is going to allow us to be able to run into stairs and let our player elevate upwards over the stairs. Okay, hit done. So we're going to tell our camera, once these conditions are met, we're going to tell our camera to follow that motion and smoothly change the height of our camera so that it looks like we are moving upwards. Because what's happening in our code is everything's being snapped into position, but that would look very awkward for the player to just all of a sudden appear higher when you hit the jump. Instead, we want a smooth transition from one Z elevation to another. So to achieve that, we're going to use the tween behavior so that we can smoothly move from one point to another. So I'm just going to go over to the layout, and we have our cam 3D that we created in the first part of this video. And with it selected over in the properties, I'm going to add a behavior, new behavior, and we have the tween behavior right here. Add that. Then I'm going to exit out of that. Back over on the event sheet, let's add some actions to this event. First thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that no other tweens are playing in the game. So let's go into meta, get our cam 3D object, and I'm going to type in stop, and I want stop all under the tween playback. We're going to stop all tweens from playing, and then we're going to start a new tween. Add an action, go into meta, get our cam 3D object again, and let's scroll down to the tweens. This one called tween one property, and we don't need to give it a tag name. Go to the properties, and we want our Z elevation. The end value, we're going to tween to our player's Z elevation. So let's type in player.Z elevation. And the time that we want it to take to tween from one point to the other is going to be a very short amount of time, 0.1. To give it a smooth effect, let's go to ease, and let's get out sinusoidal. Everything else can stay at their default value, and let's hit done. And then to wrap this little section up, if none of this stuff is taking place, then we want to set our on ground back to false because that means we are in the air. Let's select this top event that will highlight everything below it and hit X on the keyboard, and that will give us an else statement that is indented flush with our first event here, and then we'll set our on-ground Boolean. So add an action, go into system, type in Boolean, set Boolean on ground to false. Hit done. So quite a bit of code just to check if we are on the ground. If we are, then we need to snap our player into place and tween the camera movement to that for a smooth visual effect. Let's go ahead and save our game again, save often. And I'm going to scroll down a little, add an event to our collision with ground group, and I'm going to go get our cam 3D object, and let's scroll down to the tweens, and we have is any playing. Let's click on that. This says if any tween is playing, then we can do whatever, but I'm going to click on just this part and hit I to invert that. Now it says there are no tweens playing. So if no tweens are playing, then let's go ahead and snap our camera into the correct spot. So add an action, go into meta, get our cam 3D object, and I'm going to type in Z elevation, set Z elevation, and we're just going to set it to our player's Z elevation. So player.Z elevation. And we are almost done with this part. Now we have to be able to set our ground object, the solid behavior, we need to turn that off so our player can move freely, but we also want to turn it right back on so that we don't fall into the void. But this will give us a chance to jump and land back down on the ground. So let's go into our event sheet, come down here and add another event to collision with ground. And let's go into system and say every tick, and then add an action and go get our 3D ground object. And I'm going to type in solid, and we want set enabled under the solid group. And I'm going to disable it and hit done. So every tick, we are disabling the solid object so that we may pass over the solid ground and move about. So let's set up when we want to enable it again. We can add another event to our subgroup and go into our 3D objects, get our 3D ground, and let's check to see if the ground's Z elevation is higher than our player's Z elevation. So I'm going to search for compare Z elevation. Compare Z elevation, and we want to know if it is greater than our player's Z elevation. So player.Z elevation, and then we're going to subtract the 3D ground object's height. So we're already in the 3D ground object, so we can just type self.z height. And then let's just add 1 to the end of that. That'll give us that cushion. So the ground object's Z height will let our player's Z elevation know that that ground object is higher, and we would have to jump up onto it to get to it. Okay, hit done. And then we need to check for one more thing here. So let's double click on the event, go back into 3D objects, get our ground, and I'm going to type in Z elevation. Let's compare the Z elevation. Let's change our comparison to less than the player's Z elevation. So player.Z elevation. And when that happens, let's add an action. Go get our 3D ground object. I'm going to type in solid, set enabled to enabled. So this will allow our player to land on the ground object again. Okay. Let's go test this out. And I can move around, and my jump isn't working, but our stairs are working. If you notice, we can go up and down, and it's a very smooth transition. But we are floating down. So that doesn't work. Okay, I wonder if our Z-axis, remember, okay, my static got unchecked during this. So if yours got unchecked as well, make sure we check our Z-axis variable and make sure static is checked. So now if we play, we should be able to jump, and we can with the space bar. We can go up the stairs, we can go down the stairs, we can jump up to a higher platform, jump down to a lower platform, and then if we go over the empty space here where we don't have a ground object, we just fall. And we will keep falling until you reset it. So I'm going to exit out of that, and that is going to conclude this section. We have one more that will allow us to jump up onto elevated platforms. So let's make sure that we're saving, and I will see you in the next section. So we're going to make some platforms, and we're going to need to do a few things so that the game recognizes we can jump up onto them and not go through them. And then we'll finish up with just tweaking a few things, and then we will be done. So first things first, let's go over to the layout, and I'm going to scroll in, and we have the stairs object, which is really just the 3D ground object that we used for stairs. And I'm going to select any of them, hold Control, click and drag out a copy, and then zoom in here. And I'm going to resize this. I'm going to get an idea of how big I want it. And then I'm going to go into the size, and let's just make this an even 160 by 160. Okay. And then I'm going to go down and change the, actually, let's change the Z elevation to 0. So now it's flush with the ground. We can play just to see what that looks like. There we go. And then I am going to go down a little further in the properties, and I'm going to change the Z height to 8. Okay. And we have all the correct faces turned on. We don't need the back face because that would be the bottom of this platform object. And just for the fun of it, I am going to change the front face texture to, I'm going to go with this dark rock, and then I'm going to change my side textures to this gold. Change each one to the gold. And you don't have to do this. I just want something that stands out and that we can see, and we know this is our ledge. So I'm going to back my player up a little, and I'm going to move this. Let's just move this over here, and then I'm going to click and drag out a copy. So now we have 2. Let's go in to play this, and if we jump up on top of it, we land on top of it. And then we can fall off of it, and our player falls off of it. Jump up on top, and fall down. But we can also just walk right through it. And, well, that doesn't make much sense. So we need a way to block ourselves from being able to run into it and go through it, but we also don't want to create another solid instance where if it's just solid and we try to jump over it, it's going to block us. It'd be like jumping up against this wall. We would never go anywhere. So I'm going to exit out of that. And I noticed that we can still see our player sprite, this green triangle. So I'm going to select our player, scroll down, and untick initially visible. That way we won't see our player or the camera object. And I'll zoom out. I'm going to just spread these apart just a little. Okay. I just wanted to show you what that looks like. We can actually just delete these. And we're going to start with a new object. I am going to create a new layer. I'm going to right click. Let's add a layer. And I'm going to call this one platforms. And I'm going to move it in between ground and walls. And with that layer selected, let's make sure that our rendering mode is on 3D. And then I'm going to go and lock our ground layer so that we don't mess with the grounds that we already have put in. And I'm going to double click and add a new 3D shape. And then I'll just place it right about there. And I am going to give this I'm going to go with a purplish color. You don't have to do any of this if you don't want to. And then I'm going to select these faces and hit C to clear them out. And then I'm going to fill with the fill tool each one of them. And then on the back frame here, I'm going to do what I've been doing with the pencil tool and a white color with the size of 3. Just write in the word platform. Okay. And we can move that in to our 3D objects folder. And if we zoom in, we have a solid purple block that you can't really tell that it has any sides. So with that selected, I'm going to come over here and down in our use object images for faces, I'm going to change our front face object to this dark rock. And then each one of the sides to this gold color. And then we have a Z elevation of 0. I'm going to change the height to 8. And we could play this if you wanted to. And this does nothing. It's just an image. All right, with it still selected in the properties, let's rename this 3D underscore platform. Then come down here to edit behaviors. Let's add a new behavior and give it a solid. So now, if we play, we can't go through it, so that's good. And then if we try to jump up on it, we can't go anywhere because it's a solid and it is a solid in 2D space. So that solid collision goes all the way up to affinity and all the way down to affinity. I'm going to exit out of that. So we need to tell it, just like we told the ground and the stairs and everything, to not be a solid under certain conditions. And I'm going to change the size of this to 160 by 160. And while we're here, let's just go ahead and I'm going to move it over and then control click and drag a copy out over here. So we have 2 to work with. All right, let's go over to the event sheet. And let's make sure our elevated platforms group is open. And then we can add an event to our elevated platforms. And we're going to check to see where our player is in Z space. So go into objects and get our player object. And I want to compare the Z elevation. So I'm going to type in Z elevation. We get compare Z elevation. That is the one we want. And we want to know if it is greater than our new 3D platform object. So let's start typing this out. I'm going to get our 3D platform object, and I want to know its Z elevation. So dot Z elevation, and then we'll add its height to know how high that platform is. So let's get our 3D platform object again, this time dot Z height. And then let's do what we did for the ground object. Give it a little cushion, say minus 0.5. So is our player's Z elevation greater than the platform's Z elevation plus its height minus a small amount? So that will let us get over the edge of the platform and not get pushed out by our custom controls. Okay, hit done. And when this is true, if our player's Z elevation is higher than that, then that means we are jumping up in the air and we are jumping higher than the highest top part of that platform object. So then we can disable the solid so that we can move through that area. So let's add an action, go into the 3D object folder, get the 3D platform object, and I'm going to type in solid, set enabled to disable. Once this condition has been met, we get to move into that space. And then if we come down and we are no longer greater than this amount, we can turn this back on and it'll act as the same way our ground object does. So let's highlight this whole block of code. X on the keyboard will give us an else statement, and then add an action, 3D objects folder, 3D platform object, and I'm going to type in solid, set enabled to enabled. And then let's play this. Okay. We can move around, jumping, everything's working, and I cannot go through the solid object. That's good, but when I jump up on top of it, I can go through it. Now, when I move while on top of it, you see how it just shot us out of there? That's because the solid behavior got turned back on. That's why we're able to stand on top of it. But when I move, it pushes us out of that solid. So what we're going to do is exit out of that, and we'll just use the elevated platform object as a wall barrier, and we'll use an elevated ground object instead. So I'm going to scroll in to one of these, and I'm going to unlock the ground layer, and I'm going to drag out a copy of this ground object that we use for the stairs. So control click, drag out that copy. Then I'm going to click on our platform object and copy the size. So highlight it, control C to copy. Then I'm going to get our ground object that we just copied out and highlight the size and control V to paste. So now they are the exact same size. And we can go over to our platform object again, do the same thing with position, highlight it, control C to copy, and then click on our ground object we just copied, highlight the position, control V to paste, and it is in the exact same spot. But you'll notice when I move around, these images are fighting each other on who's getting rendered over the other. So if we play, you see we have that same situation right there. That's because they are on the exact same Z height and Z layer with each other. So exit out of that. Click on our 3D platform object, and I'm going to scroll down, face visibility, and I'm going to untick the front face. And then if we click on our ground object, well, actually, since they're in the same position, when I click on it, it clicks the platform. So what we can do is hover our mouse over the object, hold down the tab key and click, and that clicks what's underneath it. So you see the 3D ground object got selected. So for that, I'm going to scroll down in its properties, and I'm going to untick all the sides. So the left face, right face, top face, and bottom face. The front face is the only one selected, And down here on front face object, I'm going to change that to that dark rock color. So now we have something that looks exactly like this one, but we have two different objects here. So let's go back into this. And now when I jump up on this one, I can move around because we are actually on a ground object. But when we're down here, we cannot run into the platform because we have enabled its solid property. But once our Z elevation is above the platform object, then it turns off until we land on the ground. Okay. And then we can go back over here. This one does not have that, and it still has that same effect where it just pushes us out of the solid. All right, I'm going to exit out of that. And then if we come over here, I'm just going to select that and delete it. We have our 3D platform here. I click on it. 3D platform is on our platform layer. And if I tab click, it selects the ground object underneath it, and it is on the ground layer. Since this is a separate instance than our actual ground object, I'm going to change its layer to the platform's layer. And by doing that, we now have the ground object in its Z order is now on top of the platform object. There's our platform object. It's on the bottom in the Z order, and then our ground object is on top of it. And if you want these to change order, you can go to your Z orders panel and just click and drag it, and then it changes its Z order. But I want my ground object on top of the platform object in its Z order. Now that these are both on the platform's layer, we can lock the ground layer and just drag a box and select both of them at the same time. Control click and drag out a copy. And I'm going to scroll in here, or zoom in here, I guess, and put that close up next to that one. And I want the platform object, so I'm going to click on that, then tab click to get the platform object underneath it. And I'm going to change its Z height because I still want it to be touching the ground, but I want it to be taller. I'm going to select, let's just double it to 16. So you can see that our ground object is still down in there. So I'm going to click on it, and that gives us the 3D ground. And its Z elevation is at 7 because it has a height of 1. So the 7 plus 1 is 8, which is the height of this first one. So that puts the top of the ground object at 8. So I want to do the same thing. I want it to be the top of it to be the same height as our platform, which is 16. So that 16 minus 1 is going to be 15 because it has a Z height of 1. So it matches up perfectly. And if we play, then we can jump up here and then jump up to even higher, and we can fall down or we can fall off the edge altogether. We cannot go through it, and we still have stairs. And that is how you make platforms using this 3D first-person code. Okay, I'm going to exit out of that, and I'll do one more thing here. I'm going to zoom out and draw a selection over our newest platform. Control, click, drag out a copy of those, and then I'll do the same thing here. Click on the 3D ground. I want to go up another 8 units to 24. Actually, let's make it 30. So subtracting its Z height, that would be 29. And then we can click on our 3D platform object and change its height to 30. And I'm going to make sure that we can jump up on that real quick. Make sure it's not too tall. It is not. Okay. So we have all this room here. I'm going to exit out of this. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is get our 3D ground object. Click that. We don't want both the 3D ground and the 3D platform. We just want the ground. Control click and drag out another copy over here. And I'm going to keep it at the same height. And then I'm going to turn on, over in the properties, the left, right, top, and bottom faces. And you can see that they are now visible. And if we go in game, we now just have this ledge. And I wanted to show you this part too. First off, we can go under it. And everything is still solid around here. The problem is if we jump at this height, we go through it. You would need to have this ledge that's above our player that we can now go under. You would need this to be much higher so that we don't clip through the object when we jump. Or you could just lower the jumping strength too, but that is how that's going to work. So I'm going to exit out of that, and I'm going to turn the back face on. And I'm going to give it a texture, and I'm just going to give it that dark blue. So now it looks like an actual platform. And we can jump up here and jump onto the platform and then drop down and actually go under it. So just an option if you're using this for level design. And that is the basics of how 3D in Construct 3 works as far as a first-person perspective game. And that is going to do it for this tutorial. So hopefully this helps you out and gets you started in the right direction. This is what we'll be using moving forward. If you follow any future 3D tutorials on this channel, we will use this setup. We will use this code that has already been set up. And we will not cover this in future 3D first-person tutorial videos. Another thing to keep in mind is, as I said in the series introduction video, that I do believe the people that make the Construct 3 engine will likely create new plugins and behaviors and actions that will eliminate a lot of the code that we use to achieve all of this. When that time comes, I'll make a new updated video on how to get set up. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you found this helpful, please hit that thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please help me out. Go ahead and hit that big red button. I appreciate the support. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below and I'll get to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video.